Hello dear viewers of my channel, this is a new video, and if you want me to continue to publish videos every day, then put a like and subscribe to the channel. And here is a guy who was lucky enough to be in this video. If you also want to get a chance to get in the video, then write something in the comments and I will not delay the beginning and wish you a pleasant viewing. The main character was shocked after hearing this information, while people couldn't believe that the grandmother herself would give the verdict. The servant of the protagonist was frightened because Grandma Lu is the most powerful in the Qin family. She can order anything and no one dares to contradict her. Suddenly there was a man's voice that shouted that he could not think that he would see the protagonist in such a situation. It turned out to be Feng's longtime enemy, who was happy that the hero would definitely go to jail while he continued to live. The man started talking about how he was the first to inform the court that the hero had used the banner. Suddenly everyone started to be told that the grandmother had arrived. The grandmother came out and started talking about how the hero had almost started a war and had broken the taboos by contacting outsiders who had been exiled long ago. Grandmother was a second-level grandmaster, and she asked the protagonist if he was aware of his actions. The protagonist said with confidence in his eyes that he recognized that he had indeed committed the actions that had just been named. The grandmother began to approach the young man. Then, with a creepy face, asked the reason why the protagonist shouldn't be executed right now. While the protagonist began to smile, then began to say that the family dares to make fun of them, and he was always being pissed off by the laws that this family passed and the people who were kicked out for nothing. The protagonist began to say that the laws of their family were too terrible and that he thought it was time for a change. The old man was angry and started yelling that the protagonist was talking nonsense and called it a rebellion. The grandmother wondered if these reasons were true for such an act. The servant was incredibly frightened. He was worried that the grandmother would order the execution of the protagonist, while the man was happy that now the hero would probably die. Suddenly the old woman hit the chains of the protagonist with her staff. She started laughing and saying that this is exactly the kind of behavior her fearless grandson should have. The protagonist was surprised to see the old woman's reaction, while the other people could not believe that the grandmother would just let the protagonist go. The man started yelling that Feng had committed a huge number of crimes and should be expelled from the family right away. The grandmother began to say that such people as the protagonist is exactly what they need, because only thanks to them will be able to change the laws of their family, which are completely unfair. The grandmother began to speak before everyone present. She explained that a great trait of the protagonist is that he treats everyone equally, even the foreigners who were despised by the other members of the family. The elder was shocked by what the grandmother said, and asked how she felt about the protagonist's judgment. The grandmother remembered that there would be a tournament between the 5 families very soon, and she decided that the protagonist would definitely participate. The elders were amazed by this outcome, because the hero was not only not punished, but also rewarded. The man started shouting that all the seats were taken, and the protagonist should not get something like that, and it violates the law of their family. Grandmother agreed that according to the rules, the seats were indeed occupied. The man started to rejoice that he didn't let Feng benefit, while grandmother said that the protagonist would just take Qin Yulan's place. The man instantly froze in place after saying that. The man started crying because the grandmother had just given his place to the protagonist, while she said that he was a snitch and she just hated infighting. The protagonist thanked his grandmother, while thinking that the tournament was an incredible opportunity to become stronger. Grandma started talking about how she was going to create a youth team, and she was going to choose a group of young people with experience in land development. The grandmother then looked at the protagonist with her piercing gaze and said that Feng would be the leader of the team, which shocked the young man. While his allies were genuinely rejoicing that their master had just gotten a prestigious position, the man was crying with all his might, unable to believe what was happening. The grandmother began to say that the level of the protagonist's leadership would only depend on him, while Feng promised not to disappoint the grandmother. The protagonist was well aware that if he became the leader, he would be able to get great connections and power. A little while later, the protagonist stood near the library and thought that he needed to learn a new technique. The guy started to open the door and then went inside, thinking that although he knows a lot of techniques, it will always be useful to learn new ones. The main character was happy to read books, and thought that someday the day would come when he would read and memorize each of them by heart. Suddenly a man's voice was heard, who was surprised that Feng was hiding in such a place. The enemy began to shout that the hero dared to take his place in the tournament, and said that he intended to fight the protagonist right now. Feng explained that the enemy didn't deserve to fight, also adding that it was the grandmother who gave the man's place to him. The protagonist said that if the man wanted to fight, then let him go to his grandmother, which really hurt him. He started to get very angry. Then he started to tense his muscles so much that his clothes started to tear, and he said that the protagonist was just a coward. Feng looked indifferently at his enemy, while the enemy used a secret technique and became incredibly big and strong. The enemy's men began to say that their master's strength was unbelievable and that Feng had no chance against him. The enemy said that the protagonist should fight him like a real man. Then he instantly began to approach, and was right above the protagonist with the words that he will prove his grandmother wrong. Suddenly, the protagonist instantly slapped the man's face, after which he asked him not to interfere with him anymore while reading books. The enemy's allies couldn't believe that this had happened. The protagonist said that finding the right books was stressful, and warned that if the enemy continued to bother him, he wouldn't see the next day. The guys were very much intimidated by the protagonist's strength, after which they instantly surrounded Feng, with the intention of mobbing him. The protagonist was surprised by such insolence, but he did not think of retreating. The man was glad that his comrades did not abandon him and stood up for him, while in fact the young guys called the protagonist their new older brother. This shocked the man because he was confident in his people. He asked how they could do this to him. They looked with contempt in his direction, and then with the same contempt in his eyes began to say that the position of elder brother should belong to the strongest, and the man did not fall under this characteristic. Such words struck the man in the heart. Feng said that the guys could really be younger brothers, and then said that they should find him some martial arts books. All the guys instantly started looking for the book that the protagonist needed, while Feng was happy that so many people were helping to find books, because it would save him a lot of time. Suddenly the protagonist was surprised that the 5 great families would hold an auction. The guys explained that this was the case. They also said that the auction was necessary so that the families could demonstrate their power. They began to complain that their family had nothing to show, so they decided that their family would end up being just an observer. The protagonist thought that this was very strange because the Qin family was almost equal to the other families, but in the end it was less important than the others. The protagonist realized that the younger generation was disappointed by this and lost confidence in themselves. The protagonist began to tell them that their family was actually hiding their power, and promised them that they would be able to see the Qin family's power at the auction, while he decided that he would exhibit rare pills. The protagonist was walking around, thinking that with his experience he would be able to show all the top class. He hoped to see a great place, but as soon as he arrived at the alchemist's room he saw a dilapidated very small building. The guy was shocked by this turn of events, because inside there was not even a furnace for alchemy. Suddenly the hero heard a voice that greeted him, and began to look in that direction. It turned out that it was a cute girl who was gathering herbs around the neighborhood, and had to help the protagonist, because of which she asked that the guy gave her instructions. The protagonist said hello to the girl, while thinking that the room was given out according to the strength of the herb gatherer, and looking at the girl he assumed that she was the weakest. The hero began to enter the dilapidated building, along with his new companion. The protagonist noticed how the girl was good at categorizing herbs. The protagonist just didn't understand why the girl had such a room, but he also realized that as long as he had a furnace, other things wouldn't bother him. Feng asked what the girl's name was, and she told him to call her Hua Zhu, the flower girl. Suddenly the protagonist was so surprised that he dropped the basin, and then he immediately asked if the girl was the granddaughter of old man Hua, and she said that she was and asked how the protagonist knew her grandfather. The protagonist began to say that her grandfather was a hero, and just could not understand how she got such a terrible house, and asked if the girl is not mocked. The girl began to cry, because her grandfather told a lot about the protagonist, and then they went to meet the grandfather of this lovely lady. The protagonist instantly asked if Grandpa Hua was alright. He remembered that Grandpa was the best herb collector. In the past he was the person who introduced the protagonist to herbs, and without him the guy would not have become the person he is now. In the present the grandfather looked quite old and infirm. With tears in his eyes he asked why the protagonist had returned. Feng instantly started to ask about who dared to hurt Grandpa. The girl started to say that the one who hurt Grandpa was Qin Yulan. who after learning that the protagonist had become an alchemist came to take revenge on Grandpa for training the hero. The girl started crying hard, saying that the enemy had also taken advantage of her brother's authority to give them the worst room, and she didn't even have money to help her grandfather. The grandfather began to say that the girl would not cause problems for the protagonist, while the guy looked at her with a sad look, because it was all because of him. The protagonist started talking about how without his grandfather's efforts, he definitely wouldn't have achieved what he has now, then said that he would definitely avenge his grandfather, with an incredibly gray expression on his face. At that time, in the alchemist's largest room, the enemy began to complain to his brother about the protagonist who not only hit him, but also stole his students. While the man began to say that his brother should not worry, because he had already given the hero the worst alchemy room, and this was the first step to revenge. It turned out to be Qin Feng, who was the general manager of the Jiadan District Herbal Gathering Department. He promised to further suppress the protagonist. Suddenly, someone kicked the door with their foot, which instantly made the enemy turn around. It turned out to be the protagonist who had arrived with his new companion. The enemy approached with the words that he was going to come to take revenge on the hero, and he did not expect him to come to this place. A moment later, the protagonist silently struck a blow directly on the face of his enemy, after which the teeth of the enemy began to fly in different directions, and he began to fly at great speed right past his brother. The protagonist was beyond furious, and wondered if this man had hurt a weak old man, and an equally weak girl who had done nothing. At that time, the man was incredibly scared, and asked what exactly the protagonist was going to do. Feng said that they were challenging the man to a weed harvesting contest, and if they won, this room would be theirs. The protagonist promised that if the girl lost, he would personally be at the man's disposal. The brothers were incredibly happy about this opportunity and instantly agreed to such conditions. The girl was very worried. She did not believe that she could win, while the protagonist was confident in the skills of the girl and said that she will definitely win. A little while later they gathered in nature. The enemy said that it was time to collect herbs. The winner will be the one who after 2 hours will collect the highest level of herbs. The enemy introduced the best herb gatherers, and there were more than 10 of them. At that time, the protagonist just believed in the girl, as she was also trained by Grandpa Hua. The enemy announced the start of the competition, after which the pickers instantly started their movement, leaving the girl behind. She was very nervous and couldn't move so fast. She didn't know if she could beat the elite in this competition. Suddenly, the girl noticed an upgrade herb. Then she instantly walked towards it because it was a rank 2 herb. But suddenly a man appeared in front of her and stole the herb right from her hands. The girl accused the man of stealing the herb, while he started to run away with the words that the one in whose hands the herb is in is right. The protagonist said that the girl should not pay attention and just continue searching. If the enemies are together, they will not win. While the enemy began to say that such a fool just cannot be stronger than dozens of people, while the enemy was completely confident in his victory, because such a simple girl just cannot win. While the girl continued to be nervous, every time she found grass it was taken away by one of the enemies, and then in the place where she arrived there was nothing left. The enemies took everything clean. Enemies rejoiced because half the time had already passed, and the girl could not collect even 1 herb. They were sure that the hero lost. The girl was very upset. She blamed herself for the defeat, although the competition was still going on. The protagonist said that there was still a chance. The girl turned towards the guy who started to say that she should use her grandfather's method and use her heart to find the right herb. The protagonist was sure that with such a mentor the girl would not be able to lose. The girl took control of herself. Her eyes were filled with determination. Suddenly she noticed something on the mountain. She instantly realized that it was the plant she needed. She started climbing up the high rock with all her might, her arms suffering from it. While the opponents mocked the girl who risked her life, they were sure that they had gathered all the herbs they could gather. The girl kept repeating in her head the words that she could win, because her grandfather was the best. She began to reach for the herbs, because it was the last hope for victory. After a while the enemy said that what the girl had brought was a bunch of ordinary grass. He also added that the worst thing her opponents had brought was a first-class spiritual grass. The girl couldn't believe what she had just heard while the others mocked her. The enemy grabbed the protagonist saying that the winner of the battle had just been revealed, and promised to hit the protagonist not too hard. At that time, Feng asked the enemies who it was that told them they had lost, then grabbed a torch, and a moment later he threw it on the table where all the herbs were standing. The enemies started shouting that the hero was just trying to destroy the evidence, while Feng said that real gold is not afraid of fire, and asked the enemies to look carefully at the table. The man started shouting that all the medicinal plants had just turned into ashes and pointed his finger at the table. Then they were instantly shocked that one plant remained unharmed. The man instantly started asking his brother if the second-rank medicine that their men had found after burning could turn into a third-level herb. While the man jumped up, for the plant in front of them was more than a third-level herb, for the plant in front of them was a fourth-rank magical herb, namely the fire flow flower. The protagonist smiled at what was happening, while the enemies could not believe their eyes, because in front of them was one of the rarest plants. The protagonist began to tell that this plant looks like dry grass, and is on the mountains, and that to pick such a plant you need not only a great knowledge of herbs, but also have courage. The protagonist grabbed the girl and then asked who was the best herbalist among them. The enemies were out of anger after such a humiliating defeat. The enemy began to ask his brother if the main character's words were true, while the man began to say that it didn't make any difference whether it was true or false. After that, the man instantly turned to the girl to sell him the plant and promised to pay her 500 gold coins for it. All the enemies were shocked after hearing the amount their elder was offering. The girl was very happy about this offer, because this amount would be enough to pay for her grandfather's treatment. Suddenly, the protagonist asked the man to stop saying that he should be ashamed of trying to fool an innocent girl. The protagonist said that such a plant is only sold at auctions, where the people selling it are incredibly skilled herb collectors. The protagonist said that he would pay the girl 10,000 coins, which is twice the market value of the herb, because he wanted to have enough money to buy medicine for his grandfather, and they could live a decent life together. At that time, the enemies could not believe the amount that the protagonist said, because even a man would have to work for 10 years to get such a sum. The enemy had to simply admit defeat to the protagonist. He thought that in the future he could easily get a huge amount of similar plants. The protagonist approached the girl with a proposal. He offered her to become his herbalist, and promised to take care of her and her grandfather. She instantly agreed to the proposal of the protagonist. Suddenly the enemy began to shout that if the girl will work for him, he will provide a room much better, and will provide places much better than the garbage behind him. The girl instantly refused, saying that she only wanted to work with the protagonist. It was very painful to hear the enemy, who already believed that he had gotten the talent. The girl thought that Feng was the first person after her grandfather who believed in her talent. The protagonist was happy that he had gotten a great herb picker, so he would have another incredibly talented worker. The protagonist said that from now on this room belongs to the girl, and asked the uninvited guests to leave the room. They did so and just silently began to leave. At that time the enemy began to get angry at his brother, because in his opinion it was because of the fact that his brother turned the guys against them. At that time the protagonist was excited about the furnace that was in this best alchemy room. He was sure that he would be able to create an incredibly good pill. The protagonist was going to use the flux flower in order to improve his power. The protagonist started taking the juice of the plant thinking that he was going to perform incredibly well in the upcoming tournament. The protagonist began to meditate, and energy instantly surrounded his body. A copy of him appeared in front of the protagonist and emitted a purple aura, after which the copy instantly grabbed the guy's neck. The opponent started shouting that the protagonist couldn't defend anything, and also said that the protagonist should die. At that time, Feng was surprised that such a horrible creature lived inside him. He realized that if this creature killed him, he would really die. The protagonist believed that in any case he would not lose. Then his hand began to fill with energy and he prepared to attack. Suddenly the enemy easily blocked the fist of the protagonist that surprised the guy. The enemy started shouting that he knows the protagonist very well and there is no way he can win. The enemy attacked Feng, saying that the hero is just a coward who hurts others. The enemy continued to deliver a series of blows while saying hurtful things. The enemy was preparing to kick and saying that the hero did not deserve a second chance, and then successfully punched the attack to the protagonist. Feng realized that it wasn't just an inner demon, it was a 100,000 demon that lived inside him. The protagonist realized that the demon was too strong. The guy began to lose consciousness with thoughts that his life was about to end, while the demon was getting closer and closer. Suddenly the protagonist heard the voices of all his loved ones, an image that appeared in the guy's head. Feng instantly regained consciousness and began to scream, then began to shout that he needed to do his best to protect his loved ones in the world. The demon received the first blow and began to cough up blood. Then the protagonist continued the attack with the words that he will never lose. Feng started tearing his demon with the words that he would not lose even to himself. The enemy was instantly destroyed and disintegrated into small pieces. In the real world, the aura around the protagonist began to dissipate. Feng was incredibly happy about his new breakthrough. Now he could easily fight enemies that would be incredibly strong. A little while later, the servant began to talk about the arrival of an elder who most likely wants to cause them problems. The hero was well aware that the old man is not a good man and decided to see what he was doing. The old man started talking about how the hero had sowed trouble in the family and had taken the alchemy room. The old man began to say that they need this room more than ever because the auction is coming up and the protagonist is just trying to ruin it, and then the old man asked what punishment the protagonist should get for such a thing. The protagonist said that he was an alchemist's apprentice and added that he occupied the room only to make a decent pill for the auction. The old man didn't understand the hero's self-confidence because he hadn't been practicing alchemy long enough to get his hands on the best alchemy room. The protagonist pointed to the box, then asked if the men were sure of their words. The servant opened the box under the words of the protagonist that the guys need to see that he had done everything in a few days. They saw before them incredibly beautiful pills that glittered like little balls of gold. They couldn't believe what they saw, for even a good alchemist couldn't have achieved such quality pills. The enemies started shouting that it didn't change the fact that the hero occupied an important room for the family. The protagonist along with his servant blindfolded themselves, after which the hero told the enemies to look at another pill. Suddenly, an incredibly bright beam of light appeared which instantly blinded the enemies. They were just in shock that the protagonist managed to prepare a pill 3 class. The protagonist began to whisper something in the elder's ear while the enemies began to accuse Feng of faking the pill and that he couldn't have done such a thing. While the elder instantly slapped the men in the face, saying that although they were of the same generation as the hero, the difference between them was absolutely huge. At that time, the old man took the protagonist's hands, then instantly said that the room was a gift to the protagonist, then asked Feng to represent their family at the auction. The man couldn't believe that his father had done that to them, while the protagonist thanked the elder with a smile on his face, thinking that this year's auction would be very interesting. The day of the auction came and the man began to say that it was at this very moment that the auction between the 5 families opened. The protagonist watched carefully, while thinking that the auction was a way to show the strength of the family. The protagonist was well aware that only powerful families have the right to vote, and then the prince sitting in a beautiful place offered 40,000 coins for the body-strengthening pills. After he bought a bone bow for 20,000 coins, after which he started shouting madly that his family was paying 300,000 gold for the 7th grade pills. All the people were disappointed because the family had stolen all the items from the auction as usual, basically like all the times before. At that time, the prince smiled and thought about the day he would make the Qin family lose their face. He dreamed of taking revenge on the protagonist for the shame he experienced at the banquet. Suddenly, his reaction changed because he remembered that usually the Qin family looked embarrassed when they failed, but now they had the face of winners and were confident. The man started to announce that the auction had come to an end, while the man stopped the man with the words that the Qin family had some more items to offer. The man said that there was no problem with that, and if they really had valuable items they really could sell them. The protagonist took out a body-strengthening pill that was much more effective than the ones people had seen before. The prince was confident. A pill of this level was about like 500 level 7 pills that the prince had bought recently. All the people started laughing. After all, the hero had only brought a single pill. They thought the Qin family was a laughingstock. The guys were worried that their older brother was being humiliated on stage, while the protagonist confessed that he came to the auction with more than 1 pill. After that, whole boxes of similar pills were seen, and the protagonist confessed that there were hundreds of such pills. All the people were just in shock from what they saw because it is hundreds of pills which had incredibly high quality. The prince was angry because how could the Qin family get such a huge amount of pills of 8 times the quality? While the younger protagonist's juniors were incredibly happy, because now their family would definitely be very rich. All the families began to want such pills badly, for such quantity and quality would instantly make all the warriors in the family much stronger. The prince shouted that he was betting 200,000 gold, and also added that anyone who dared to raise the bet would be forgiven by the royal family. All the people were incredibly angry, as this wasn't the first time the prince had used the royal status for his own gain. While the prince thought the protagonist was stupid because he could keep such a good thing for his family instead of selling it at auction, the protagonist agreed to the bid and announced that the E family would receive the pills. The protagonist thought that they were just extra pills that they didn't need, while the prince thought that he had gotten the treasure. The protagonist started to announce that he was going to show their main item, after saying that all the people were shocked because they thought the last item was the main item. Feng announced that he was going to sell a grade 3 elixir while the man held a closed box. People weren't surprised by the grade 3 elixir, as there was already a similar item in the auction. They were expecting something more. While Feng started to say that this wasn't an ordinary grade 3 elixir, he smiled and said that they would understand everything once they saw it. Suddenly, after opening the box, a beast-shaped aura began to burst out from the elixir, and it instantly moved towards the people, scaring them very much. Everyone was shocked because the elixir in front of them was an incredibly rare altered elixir, compared to which a normal grade 3 elixir was just trash. The old man was a little embarrassed and very happy. He remembered the moment when the hero confessed that it was not a normal grade 3 elixir. He had done the right thing by listening to the protagonist. While the prince was amazed at what he saw, he assumed that the Qin family had hired some incredible alchemist. All the people began to be incredibly eager to get their hands on this elixir, as it was just an incredibly cool item. At that time, the prince started shouting that he was buying this item on behalf of his father, and added that anyone who tried to take this item would be considered a traitor. The people were shaking with fear and anger over the situation, as the prince continued to take advantage of the fact that he was a member of the imperial family. At that time, the protagonist said that he agreed to this and asked the prince for 500,000 gold for this item. The prince considered the protagonist a real fool for selling such an elixir and immediately agreed to the amount of the deal. Suddenly, the prince was informed that he had already spent all his money on useless things, and he just didn't have enough money to buy this elixir. People laughed at the fact that the prince didn't have the money to buy the item. Then the protagonist asked if it was true that the prince didn't have the money to buy the item. The protagonist started laughing at the guy, saying that he is a real clown who doesn't even have money. The prince was furious. These words hurt him very much. In the end, the protagonist was able to sell this item for 700,000 gold. And the juniors said that Feng is incredibly cool. It was at this auction that the Yi family became the ultimate laughingstock. The old man sincerely thanked the protagonist, because it had been a very long time since their family had had such a good time at the auction. The elder promised that he would definitely pay for the hero to bring good fame to their family, and the hero thanked the old man. The old man also asked the guy not to get too excited, because there were enough advantages and disadvantages to being the center of attention. It was on this day that the protagonist shone, and he was remembered by many. For this reason, the old man was worried that the guy might become a target for others at the tournament. He said that although the prince wasn't very strong, he had a level 5 bodyguard who could easily defeat many people. There was also a young genius from the Bai family who didn't even fight opponents below level 6, and a girl from the Nangong family who was said to be doomed to defeat anyone she fought. There was also a man from the Situ family who relied on his ancestral fighting style and was incredibly good at killing. The old man started to say that these were the most dangerous opponents the protagonist could have at the tournament, and so he asked the guy to be as careful as possible. The protagonist thought that in fact the most fearsome opponent is the prince, and the elder is wrong about him. In fact, the prince has the ability to hide his power. The protagonist was determined to win, so he was going to work hard on his strength that would definitely show incredible power. 3 days later, the grandmother's birthday banquet was held, and the representatives of the other 4 families arrived. The families sent incredibly large gifts, for which Grandma thanked everyone and said she was honored. Suddenly a girl appeared and started talking about how no one from the Qin family had ever given a decent gift. She started talking about how they just couldn't afford to give something nice. The men were incredibly angry because she was partly right, because the Qin family was not that rich. The girl was glad that she was right, and was not sorry for having decided to leave the Qin family. Suddenly, the girl turned to hear the voice of the main character, who had decided to give a gift to his grandmother. Feng started talking about how he was going to gift a high-quality body-strengthening pill that had 9 points. The hero opened a chest that contained pills that looked like real pearls. People were shocked, but the price of such pills really wasn't too high. At that time, the girl started talking about how rare it was, and then added that compared to her gift of 300,000 gold, it was no comparison at all. The men said that the protagonist should not have given this gift. They felt as awkward as possible. The protagonist asked why the girl thought he was done and started bragging like that. After that, the main character asked to bring something which surprised the girl. Thanks a lot to everyone who watched this video to the end. If you liked the video, then share your opinion in the comments and put a like, and I will continue to try to make videos as often as possible. I also want to thank you all for your support in the comments and for the advice you give me. It's really nice to see the feedback from you. Thanks again and see you all soon.